Hi everyone, thank you for clicking on this video. To new and existing subscribers, welcome. I'm Lindsay and I'm going to show you how to put a journal cover together. It's just the cover in this video to keep them short and sweet, and the following videos will be the rest of the journal making process. So I'm using cereal box card. I always use cereal box card. It's always readily available for me, and it's recycling at its finest when all said and done, and that's what a junk journal is, right? So I am using 3 pieces, and I've got obviously a front and back cover. I'm going to use the pieces, I'm not covering them entirely. You can cover these so you don't see any of the pattern, but I found the way that I'm going to do it that I'm not going to see that pattern through it. So I'm using the non-pattern side, which will sit under the fabric, as you see here. I'm just lining it up because I want that floral image to be centered on the front cover. So I'm using the pattern side facing up, as you can see here, and I'm going to use the plain side so you don't see any of that pattern through the fabric. This is quite a thick fabric anyway, so it's not necessarily going to show through, but to try and curb it as much as possible, I'm going to use it the non-pattern side down. And you can see here I'm just writing out the measurements. So the pieces are 4.5 inches wide by 6.25 inches tall, and then the spine, I always do a 2.5 inch spine. So they're the sizes that I'm using here. These are not specific sizes to any sort of official dimensions or anything. All I've done in the past is use a bit of paper. I folded it in half, A4 sheet in half, and then I tear it in half, and then so essentially you've got an A5 sheet of paper, which I fold in half, and then I held it on the cereal box. I gave it a couple of millimeters around the edge, and that's how I started off with the dimensions of the covers I use. And I've got these dimensions now, which seem to just work for me every time. So that is what I now use. There's no sort of rhyme or reason to it. It's not a specific actual say A6 size necessarily. It's just a size that I find works for me for my smaller size junk journals. So the spine piece, I am going to use the opposite way around, so the pattern side's going down, and I've put some masking tape on it, again just to try and curb the pattern coming through a little bit on the outside. And the reason that I'm using it upright, so the plainer side is on the inside, is because I'm using this little bit of linen to cover the spine, and between the signatures I don't want to see that pattern, which is likely to come through this fabric because it's a much thinner fabric. So, and I've also masking taped or washi taped just on the edge of each book corner, the adjoining edge to the spine, because again some pattern could come through this fabric. We're going to cover the inside anyway with some wallpaper, but there will be that little gap where the wallpaper doesn't go right up to the crease. So I've covered that with a bit of tape as well, just to mask off a little bit. So I'm going to trim around the edge of the fabric now. I'm probably giving it about 1/2 inch all around the edge. You can give it however much you need to give it. It doesn't necessarily matter. You just want it as neat as possible. You can do this the other way around if you prefer. So I have the linen stuck on already in the middle, and I'm going to fold the fabric over the linen. So I'm cutting that fabric edge as nice and straight and neat as I can, because you are going to see that edge. You'll see what I mean in a moment. You can glue it down, then stick the linen over the top. It would look nice if you had the linen stuck on the top, and then maybe you rough the top and bottom up, so take some of the threads out to give it a bit more of a frayed edge. That would look quite nice. Or if you're using like a pretty bit of lace perhaps, and you don't mind it overhanging at the top and the bottom, that would look just as nice. But for the materials that I'm using, I've stuck the linen down to cover the inside of the spine, and I'm going to stick the fabric over the top. And I'm starting the folding. You can cut the corners off. You're probably actually better off cutting the corners off for this fabric, which I'm now thinking would probably be the best way to go forward, because I'm going to use book corners, so yeah, like little metal corners on my book. You could cut it off. I normally, if I'm not going to use book corners, I wouldn't cut the fabric. So I wouldn't, by cutting I mean the triangle pieces that I fold down. You'll see a lot of people, especially when you're covering a book with paper, will cut that off and then fold the 2 flaps so they join, and it makes it nice and neat. I don't like doing that as much, especially with fabric, because then you can get that sort of hole on the corners. But because I'm going to use book corners, that would obviously prevent that from happening. So it's entirely your choice at this stage. I folded it over, or you can just cut the corners off and then fold the fabric over, and then obviously use book corners. If you're not using book corners, I would just stress that I wouldn't cut them off. It won't look as neat as, because the material won't go over the corner. It will be it will kind of go either side of it, and then you'll have that little bit. And I've got a book that I've done in the past for myself, and it's frayed on the corner and the threads, and it just looked a mess. I added a book corner to it in the end, a little metal one, and that solved that problem. And again, that's something you can do later down the line if need be. So you can see here, this is not perfect. You know, I never really try and make mine perfect. I make them as nice and as neat as possible, but they're by no stretch perfect. So what I am going to do is I'm going to sew. So instead of using a ton of glue, I sew mine, and I think that gives it a much nicer finish. So you can see here, I'm sewing down the spine, mainly because I don't want any piling up. So when you open and close the book, especially with fabric, unless you add a ton of glue, you might get some, so when you open and close it, you might get some, like, I don't know how to explain it, like bubbling, where the material kind of doesn't obviously stay stuck, stay flat to the book. So yeah, I just didn't want that. I want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So I sew down the edges, and now I'm going to sew right around the outside to give it, again, a nice, neat, really sturdy finish. Obviously I've glued it down, and gluing it was more than sufficient if you don't have a sewing machine. I just like the look that the sewn edge gives. Simple. So I'm folding it through. I'm using my foot, I'm using a zipper foot actually, so I can really see where my needle is going, and it really allows me to keep like that nice sort of straighter line, and allows me to keep closer to the edge. For me anyway, I just feel it helps me. Also with the stitching, I'm starting in the corner, so that the start and end, so whether you do the back stitching at the start and end, that's all in the corner. So that can be hidden as much as possible with the book corners. And I've had to kind of go out and come in of this one, instead of going round to one continuous line, I've had to do it in a few lines, just because of the way that I was feeding it through the machine. But otherwise that is done. Now again, at this stage you need to think about your closure, and for this one I'm adding some eyelets, and I'm going to add a little bit of I'm not even sure, I still don't know what it is. I want to say it's seam binding, and it's not. I'll have to find out what it is. I bought this reel of it from Amazon when I was making the drawstring bag at Christmas, so I'm just using some of that because I like that fabric, that whatever it is. So I'm going to use something, you can use anything here. You can use sari silks, really pretty. You can use some nice lace. You could use strips of fabric. Get an old t-shirt and cut it into strips. You know, maybe you've got an old, like a child's t-shirt maybe that you really like, the colour of the fabric of. I've used my kids' clothes before in the past, because then it's sentimental value as well. So yeah, just use your imagination, look around. I'm sure you can find something. You don't necessarily need to go out and buy something especially. So I've put my book corners on here, and I'm just using a pair of pliers. These are just jewellery pliers, just to squash them on. And I did add a bit of fabric tack just on the top of the corner to make sure they're really well adhered. But just squashing them together would serve the purpose. Now I have a really old-fashioned way of doing this. Well, I think it's old-fashioned anyway. I've had this, it's called a silence setter. It's like the olden day version of the crocodile, which I see a lot of people using. I'd love to get a crocodile, but while I've got this tool, I just can't justify buying the crocodile, because this does the job. It's just a bit more of a, I don't know, a bit more of a, you have to put some elbow grease into it to get it to work. You're meant to use a hammer, I think, but I don't think I have one of those lying around my craft room. So anyway, so you pierce the hole, you put the eyelet in, you squash it all down at the back, just like you do the crocodile. You just have to do it manually. So I didn't film the process because the camera was wobbling all about the place, because the table was anyway, I didn't film it. But there are plenty of people out there that have shown better ways of doing it. So I'm just feeding that fabric through the eyelets, and I'm gluing it down. And you want to think about it at this stage, because, I mean, you don't have to, you can do this later. you can do it. I'm going to cover the inside with some nice wallpaper. And obviously I don't want that showing where you can see the fabric going through there and the eyelets and things, so I wanted to add it in at this stage. So you can see now I'm going to cover it over with the wallpaper, and it will make it nice and neat and seamless. Of course, if you don't mind seeing the inside of the eyelets, and you could maybe put just little knots in the back of your fabric, that would work equally as well. And I have done that again on previous journals. So just do it however it works for you, however is easiest for you. My previous journal, the one that I'm going to sell, that I've done already, I am going to add like a little D ring. I mentioned it in the previous video. So I'm going to pierce some holes and sew that on, and then add probably the same fabric. I just don't know what it's called. Is it fabric? Lace trim? What? I don't know. Yeah, so I'm going to add the same stuff and just add like a different style of closure, just kind of a little play. I tend to do this kind of closure just because it's like my go-to, but you know, it's nice to branch out. These pieces here I haven't measured. I literally, you saw me a minute ago holding them up, quite simply holding them up against the book page, and I've used my nail to kind of make a little indent of where I need to cut. So there's no trick to doing this. It's just I do a lot of eyeballing. I don't use measurements very often, just because I like to just have creative freedom, throw the journals together. So yeah, and then I just used the one that I cut out because I was happy with the size of it. I used the one to draw around and create the second one. And I love this wallpaper, absolutely love it. I've only got samples of it that I ordered from, if you're in the UK, Wallpaper Direct are brilliant for like wallpaper samples. They come really quickly as well. They've got like a really good selection. I mean, I use Wallpaper Direct anyway for the house, which is how I kind of came across it. But yeah, they do a really good selection, and I think I'm probably going to, in fact, I think I'm probably going to end up with this wallpaper somewhere in my house when I move, because I just love it so much. I love the texture of it. I'm probably going to end up with this on a wall somewhere, so whatever I'm left with, of course I'm going to use in my journals as well. So yeah, that is literally the cover done. I hope that was informative and it was interesting to watch. Stay tuned, as I said, hit subscribe if you haven't already, to see the journal unfold and actually come together and become a journal. And then following on from that will be some journal with me's, which I'm really excited to get on with. So yeah, until next time, take care, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.